This fall at Kenilworth Union Church, Katie and Christine and Sarah and I have been preaching this sermon series called This Is Us. After the television show, we're identifying 11 distinctive characteristics about this congregation in preparation for our transition. Today, I want to describe this congregation as educated. To do that, we'll look at a story from the Gospel according to St. John chapter 1. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to Philip, "Follow me." Philip found Nathanael and said to Nathanael, "We have found the Messiah." Nathanael said to Philip, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." When Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him, he said of him, "Behold, an Israelite in whom there is no guile." Nathanael asked Jesus, "Where did you get to know me?" And Jesus answered, "I saw you sitting under the fig tree." And Nathanael replied, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. I love Jesus' disciple who's called Nathanael. I love Nathanael because we think he's a scholar. Now, how do we know that Nathanael might be a scholar? There are a couple of clues in the text. First of all, it's possible that Nathanael might be a scholar because he is a cynic. When he discovers this new hot rabbi in town, the paparazzi are chasing, his name is Jesus, Nathanael is briefly excited with everybody else until he finds out that Jesus is from Nazareth, a hick town full of fishermen, carpenters, shopkeepers, and yahoos, and no research university. Cambridge or Berkeley, it ain't. Can anything good come out of Nazareth, he sneers. One of the downsides to smart people is that they get superiority complexes, right? They think they're better than the rest of us. Nathanael begins his apostolic career with a sneer. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? That's the first clue that Nathanael might be a scholar. He's a cynic. There's another clue. When Jesus first spies Nathanael walking down the road, Jesus blurts out, apropos of nothing whatsoever, "Behold, an Israelite in whom there is no guile." What you see with Nathanael is what you get, says Jesus. No deceit, no duplicity, no fraud, no falsehood. What you see is what you get. Now, Nathanael thinks Jesus is a yahoo. Nevertheless, he's flattered. And so he says, "Jesus, do you and I know each other? How'd you get to reading my mail? Did you Google me?" And Jesus says, "No, Nathanael, I saw you sitting under the fig tree." And that's the clue, you see. You've heard me say this before, that a fig tree in the courtyard of these small adobe first century Palestinian homes was the best place to read your books, to study. There was no air, there was no light in these small, almost windowless adobe homes. So you went outside and sat under the fig tree to do your studying. Under the fig tree was the equivalent of Evanston Public Library. So that's why we think Nathanael might be a scholar. He's a cynic and he's smart. He reads a lot. This is my fourth congregation, and all four of them have been full of Nathanaels. I just want to tell you what a privilege it has been for 40 years now to preach to a congregation like this, where a few people will sit with me on a weekday evening in the Culbertson room to think about Luther, Calvin, Knox, Shakespeare, Lincoln, C.S. Lewis, and J.R.R. Tolkien. People who will travel with me to the Lyric Opera to hear The Marriage of Figaro, or go to Chicago Shakespeare Theater to see The Tempest. It's been a real privilege. So what percentage of this congregation has master's degrees, do you think? Nationally, it is about 15%. I'll bet it's pretty much double here, don't you think? Maybe that's an exaggeration, I don't know. Now, this is not a boast. This is not a value judgment. This does not make us smarter than anybody else. It just makes us different. This is us. We've gotten good educations in our past. Now, over the years in my 4 churches, it's been fascinating to mix and mingle with different local cultures. Every local congregation builds its own culture in the place where it exists, right? So my first church, for example, was outside Philadelphia. And so a lot of my parishioners worked in the insurance industry. I actually had a lot of actuarials in my first church. My second church was in Western Michigan, where the 2 biggest employers were Steelcase and the hospital that eventually became home to the Michigan State University Medical School. And so in my congregation there, I had a bunch of people who were in the furniture industry, who worked for Steelcase and Hayworth and Herman Miller, and nurses and doctors from the hospital. I had one friend who worked for Steelcase. She purchased fabric to cover their desk chairs with. She was always traveling to Georgia, visiting the fabric mills to find out what fabric was available. Fascinating job. My third church was in Greenwich, Connecticut. Guess what those folks did for a living? And here we are in my 4th church, and we have a gaggle of lawyers and bankers. Now, all of those experiences, those educations were very different from each other. They put a different imprint on the local culture, right? So an engineering degree from Purdue, which equips you to design desks and chairs for Steelcase, is a very different degree from what you will get at Northwestern Law, where you get your JD degree. But they both put their imprint on the local culture, and it's been wonderful to absorb some of that over the years. Now, not everybody likes to do a lot of lofty thinking at church. All they want to do is come here and pray and sing and worship God. Hard thinking is too much hard work. In my last church, I befriended the chair of the philosophy department at St. John's University in Queens. Yeah, that's St. John's, the basketball school. But they also had a great philosophy department. Now, Paul Gaffney was his name, and to teach philosophy at St. John's, you have to be a pious Roman Catholic, obviously. So Paul didn't worship at the First Presbyterian Church of Greenwich, but he was always in Fairfield County hanging out with us Presbyterians. Now, it won't surprise you to learn that St. John's University in Queens has a second campus in Rome. It's right down the road from the Vatican. So every summer, Paul Gaffney, my friend, would go to Rome for 3 months to teach philosophy at St. John's University Rome campus, which means, of course, that Paul spoke fluent Italian. Paul Gaffney reads Dante's Divine Comedy in Italian. Imagine my delight when Dr. Gaffney offered to teach a course at First Presbyterian Church of Greenwich on Dante's Divine Comedy. I said, Paul, you won't make us read it in Italian, will you? He said, no, I'll read it in Italian, you can read it in English. So we threw this class on the comedy, the whole thing, 3 parts, Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso, 100 cantos. We were so excited at the first class, 4 people showed up. And they were all my friends. They weren't there to learn about Dante, they were there out of loyalty to me. And I was so crushed, I was grumbling and whining. But I had another friend in Greenwich. His name was David Robertson. In his youth, David had earned an aeronautical engineering degree at MIT. The only job David could ever get was working for NASA in Houston. He was literally a rocket scientist. And he was one of the 4 people who showed up to learn about Dante. Loyal to me, he was my friend. And I was complaining to David that no one wanted to hear the chair of the philosophy department at St. John's University talk about the Divine Comedy. No one wanted to do that. And he said to me just gently and kindly, he said, Bill, the average Presbyterian doesn't want to read Dante at church. But there are a lot of people at the First Presbyterian Church of Greenwich who want to belong to a congregation where somebody is reading Dante. I don't know why that meant so much to me. It just meant that the 4 of us were doing something for the greater good. Now, you may not want to read Hans Küng when you come to church. That's fine. Even for me sometimes, reading Hans Küng feels like taking a second job washing dishes at Applebee's. You may not want to do that, but you might want to belong to a congregation where somebody is reading Hans Küng. This is your place. It's worth remembering, after all, that education doesn't necessarily make us more humane or Christian, right? If your character is as rotten and mushy as a rain-soaked plank from your beachside deck in Pentwater, then education isn't going to do you any good. In fact, it'll be bad for you because it will make you smarter and therefore more efficient at prosecuting your scandals. It's often pointed out that the people who ran the gas chambers at Auschwitz went home at the end of the day to read Goethe and to listen to Beethoven. Yes? You know what's a great film? Great film, The Zone of Interest. Schindler's List gets the same point across. If your heart is pure, though, and education can hone and sharpen and shape your virtue in fetching ways. Are you an autodidact? Do you self-educate? Look, your university degree might be 20 or 30 years old. How are you keeping that aging education in shape? You go to Planet Fitness to tone your abs. What about your mind? People actually come up to me quite a bit. A parishioner will say, Dr. Evertsberg, tell me what to read to become a better Christian. I want a syllabus. I want a curriculum. Tell me how to do it. And I love it when that happens. So thank you for asking. Here it is. First step is, of course, you have to read the Bible, right? I'm not kidding. The whole thing, from Genesis to Revelation. Don't skip the boring parts. The Bible has 1,189 chapters, so it will take you 3 years, 3 months, and 3 days to get through the whole thing. And when you're done, you can start all over because you will have forgotten 3 years ago what you read. The Hebrew Psalter has 150 psalms. You can get through the whole Psalter twice in a year if you read a psalm a day. By the time you're 70 years old, you'll practically have the whole thing down to memory. You can read a poem a day. George Herbert, John Donne, Gerard Manley Hopkins, Emily Dickinson, Jane Kenyon, Billy Collins, all of these great poets. The poet William Carlos Williams once said, "It's difficult to get the news from poems, and yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there." Yes. You can read a daily, a weekly, and a monthly. Daily, the Journal, the Times, the Tribune. A weekly, Time Magazine, the New Yorker. A monthly, the Atlantic or Harper's. Read as many books as you know what you should do? You should read Jonathan Ives' prize-winning novel, King o' Life, or one of Walter Isaacson's biographies of Albert Einstein or Elon Musk. And you should get your hands on as many gospel-shaped stories as you possibly can. I don't mean books that are about the gospel. I mean stories that are shaped like the gospel. Stories that recapitulate Jesus' greatest story about a worthless son who squandered his inheritance in riotous living and found himself with nothing, but came to himself and went running home into the waiting arms of his father. That kind of story. You know what I'm talking about. Les Miserables, The Brothers Karamazov, Huck Finn, The Grapes of Wrath, To Kill a Mockingbird, Demon Copperhead, all of these great books. So practice the stewardship of the life of the mind. Keep in shape your aging education. First thing Nathanael said about Jesus was, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" He begins his apostolic career with a sneer. But the next thing Nathanael says is, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." That's where a great education will end up.